I want to start with a document that almost nobody covering the Tinubu Must Go protests has stopped to read. It is the Federation Account Allocation Committee, FAAC communique for June 2023, 1 month after President Bola Tinubu removed the petrol subsidy. That month, the federal government's share of the Federation account distribution was 280.4 billion naira. The 36 states collectively received 380.2 billion naira. I want you to hold that number, 380.2 billion naira, because it is at the center of a question that the protest narrative, in almost every version I have read, never actually asks. The prevailing account of what is happening in Nigeria right now goes like this: a suffering population, exhausted by fuel price hikes, currency collapse, and food inflation, has finally reached a breaking point and is demanding that a specific president leave office. That account is not wrong, but it is incomplete in a way that I think changes the political meaning of what we are watching. Before I go further, I want to be clear about how I work. Every claim you will hear in this video is traceable to a named law, a documented figure, a dated record, or a named actor's verified position. Nothing I tell you is speculation dressed as fact. If that's the standard you've been looking for, subscribe now. That's the only thing this channel promises, and it's the only promise I intend to keep. Let me show you exactly who holds authority over the things Nigerians are protesting about, because what I found when I mapped that authority carefully doesn't match the geography of the anger. Start with petrol price. The fuel subsidy removal on May 29, 2023 was a decision made by the Federal Executive Council acting through the National Nigerian Petroleum Company Limited, which had already been restructured as a commercial entity under the Petroleum Industry Act 2021. Legal authority, Section 7 of the NNPC Act 2021 and the deregulation provisions of the PIA. The decision was the president's. That part of the protest narrative is accurate.
But now, follow the cost of living more carefully. Food prices. The primary regulators of food markets in Nigeria are state governments and local government councils through market fees, produce levies, haulage taxation at state checkpoints, and the administration of land for farming under the Land Use Act 1978. The Land Use Act vests control of all land in Nigeria in state governors. Every farmer who cannot access land, every smallholder whose title is insecure, is navigating a system whose administrator is a state governor, not the President of the Republic. School fees. Primary and secondary education in Nigeria is constitutionally a concurrent function, but in practice, the federal government funds only federal unity schools. The 10,500 plus public secondary schools in Nigeria are funded, staffed, and managed by state governments from their FAAC allocations and internally generated revenue. When a parent in Kano or Owerri cannot afford school fees, that is a state government budget decision. Healthcare. Primary healthcare delivery is a local government function under the 4th schedule of the 1999 Constitution. Secondary healthcare, general hospitals, is state. The National Health Act 2014 created the Basic Healthcare Provision Fund, funded partly from the Consolidated Revenue Fund, but its implementation at the point of delivery is a state responsibility. The nearest public hospital to most Nigerians is not a federal institution. Now let me show you the actors who have been most visible on the protest narrative. The Labour Congress. The Nigeria Labour Congress under Joe Ajero called the August 2024 general strike and aligned itself publicly with the End Bad Governance protests. What I found when I looked at the NLC's documented positions is that its primary demand, reversal of the fuel subsidy removal, is addressed exclusively to the federal government, even though the transmission mechanism from petrol price to food price runs through state road infrastructure, state market regulation, and local government levy collection. The NLC has not, in any documented public statement I have found, called for a specific state governor to account for food prices in their state. The social civics organizations, groups including Enough is Enough Nigeria and the Take It Back movement, have centered their demands on federal executives. Their documented positions going back to the 2012 Occupy Nigeria protests over a higher subsidy removal show a consistent pattern.
Federal government as the target of accountability demands, state governments as bystanders. The 36 governors. Here is what I found most striking. As of publication of this analysis, not a single Nigerian governor, from the All Progressives Congress, the People's Democratic Party, or the Labour Party, has publicly stated what they have done with the increased FAAC receipts their states have received since the subsidy removal increased the federal allocation pool. The governors have been, in the language of this analysis, institutionally absent from a cost of living crisis over which they have substantial constitutional jurisdiction. The closest parallel I have found to this structural pattern is the 2012 Occupy Nigeria protests. In January 2012, President Goodluck Jonathan announced the removal of petrol subsidies. The protests that followed, among the largest in Nigerian post-independence history, were addressed entirely to the federal government. The state governors, who were simultaneously receiving increased FAAC receipts as a result of the removal, were not principal targets of any documented accountability demand. The 2012 protests ended with a partial reversal of the subsidy. The structural condition that made the governors invisible to the accountability demand was never examined. What I want you to take from this phase is one precise observation: the geography of Nigerian political anuga, the consistent direction in which accountability demands travel, is not an accident of popular instinct. It is a product of a specific institutional architecture, and that architecture has a history I am going to take you through carefully. I want to take you through things that, when you see them together, explain why Nigerian political grievance flows exclusively toward the federal center, and why that pattern has persisted across every protest, every administration, and every region since 1960. Layer 1. The constitutional architecture of centralization. Nigeria operates under the 1999 Constitution, a document drafted by a military government and returned to civilian hands without significant structural revision. The exclusive legislative list in the second schedule of that constitution contains 68 items reserved for federal legislation: defense, immigration, currency, external affairs, mines and minerals, nuclear energy, railways, aviation, and critically, petroleum. The concurrent list, where states share legislative authority with the federal government, contains 30 items, and these are the items that most directly touch daily life: education, health, and agriculture. But here is what I found when I read those lists against the revenue structure. The exclusive list concentrates the most lucrative revenue bases in federal hands. Petroleum rents alone account for between 70 and 85% of Nigeria's export revenue in any given year, depending on oil prices. This is documented in CBN annual reports going back to 1970. The federal government collects the revenue from the most valuable resources, then shares it downward through FAAC. States are structurally dependent on that transfer, and structural dependency produces political dependency. Citizens who understand that the money comes from Abuja direct their anger at Abuja. This architecture was not accidental. It was designed first by General Yakubu Gowon's military government during the oil boom in the 1970s, and then embedded further by subsequent military administrations who found that centralizing revenue made it easier to manage the political loyalties of a fragmented federation. The derivation principle, which had given oil-producing regions 50% of revenue from their territories under the 1960 and 1963 constitutions, was reduced progressively to 45% in 1970, to 20% in 1975, to 3% in 1982, before being restored to 13% under the 1999 constitution. Every reduction concentrated more revenue at the federal center. Every concentration trained citizens to look to the federal center for economic relief. Layer 2. The FAAC mechanism and what it actually redistributes. The Federation Account Allocation Committee distributes revenue from the Federation account to the three tiers of government every month. The sharing formula, last formally revised by the Revenue Mobilization and Allocation Fiscal Commission in 2004, though a new formula has been in litigation and negotiation for years, gives the federal government 52.68%, states collectively 26.72%, and local governments 20.60%. There's also a 13% derivation payment to oil-producing states before the main sharing. What I want to show you is what happened to FAAC distributions after May 29, 2023. The fuel subsidy removal eliminated a federal expenditure that had been running between 3 trillion and 4.7 trillion naira annually, depending on the year. When that expenditure was removed, the Federation account, which was being partially depleted to fund the subsidy, began accumulating more. FAAC distributions increased. In November 2023, 6 months after the removal, total FAAC distribution reached 1.3 trillion naira for that single month alone, a record at that point. The state's collective share of that single month distribution was approximately 347 billion naira.
Those revenues went to the 36 state governments. What the governors did with those revenues, whether they cushioned the cost of living impact in their states, invested in food supply chains, reduced market levies, expanded public health care capacity, is largely undocumented in any accessible public accountability framework. The Nigerian Open Government Partnership, which Nigeria joined in 2016, has produced state transparency indices, but state-by-state public expenditure tracking at the granularity needed to answer that question is not consistently available. I want to be honest about the limits of what I can prove here. I cannot tell you with documented precision that Governor X of State Y received 40 billion naira and spent none of it on food price mitigation. The data does not exist in accessible form. What I can tell you is that the accountability architecture, the public pressure, the media focus, the protest infrastructure was not directed at finding out. Layer 3. The political geometry of the protest. Here is what I found when I looked at the political alignment of the August 2024 protest infrastructure. The End Bad Governance protests, which peaked in early August 2024, drew their most intense activity in states governed by the APC's opponents, Plateau State, parts of the Northwest, and certain Southwest urban centers. The Labour Party, whose presidential candidate, Peter Obi, received significant protest demographic support in 2023, was publicly sympathetic to the protests. The PDP, which governs several southern states, was visibly absent from both supporting and condemning the protests in a way that would have required their governors to account for their own records. The Take It Back movement, one of the primary organizing networks, was founded by Omoyele Sowore, a presidential candidate who has contested elections against incumbents of both the APC and PDP. His documented political trajectory is that of someone whose primary institutional target is always the federal executive, not in any prominent campaign I have found, state-level governance structures. I'm not suggesting the protests were manufactured or that the grievances are not real. I'm making a different, more precise observation. The institutional target of the protest was selected in a way that was politically legible to opposition formations and media allies, and that selection happened to exclude the tier of government with the most direct constitutional responsibility for the cost of living. Layer 4. The mechanism I have not fully opened yet. There is one structure that connects the constitutional architecture, the FAAC mechanics, and the political geometry of the protest into a single explanation, and I'm going to show you exactly what it does before this analysis is finished. It is the Land Use Act of 1978. Every account of this protest I have read stops at petrol price and exchange rate. Not one accounts for the Land Use Act's role in structuring food prices, agricultural access, and the cost of shelter in Nigeria. That's where I'm taking you next.
Let me show you what the Land Use Act actually does at the level of ordinary Nigerian life, because this is the mechanism I flagged at the end of the last section, and it connects everything. The Land Use Act of 1978, promulgated by the Obasanjo military government and then deliberately entrenched in the 1999 and 2019 constitutions, such that amending it requires concurrent action by the National Assembly and at least 2/3 of state houses of assemblies, vests all land in Nigeria in the governor of each state, held in trust for the people. No Nigerian citizen owns land in fee simple. Every land holding is either a right of occupation, statutory, granted by the governor, or customary, recognized but not secured, or it is nothing. What this produces at the economic level is the following specific chain, which I want to trace carefully. A smallholder farmer in Benue or Kebbi State who wants to expand cultivation cannot do so without a certificate of occupation issued by the state government. That process, which is supposed to be administrative, is in practice discretionary, slow, expensive, and in many states requires informal payments. The World Bank's Doing Business indicators, before they were discontinued, consistently ranked Nigeria poorly on registering property, and the Land Use Act is the structural reason. When land access is insecure and expansion is administratively blocked, agricultural output grows more slowly than population. When supply grows more slowly than population, food prices rise structurally, independent of petrol prices, independent of exchange rates. Now, follow the shelter cost. In Lagos State, for instance, governed currently by APC Governor Babajide Sanwo-Olu, who is politically aligned with Tinubu, the cost of residential land in urban areas has increased at a rate documented by the Nigerian Institute of Estate Surveyors and Valuers at between 18% and 35% annually over the past decade. That appreciation is partly a function of urbanization, but it is also a function of the C of O system, which makes formal land titles scarce, which concentrates landholding in the hands of those who can navigate the bureaucratic and financial barriers to formal titling, which reduces supply to the rental and purchase market. The governor who administers the Land Use Act in Lagos State is not a federal official. The governor who administers it in Kano is not a federal official. Every protest demand that stops at Tinubu and does not reach Babajide Sanwo-Olu or Abakebia Yusuf in Kano or Umo Eno in Akwa Ibom is a demand that has mapped its anger onto one tier of government, while the tier with daily administrative control of land, the physical foundation of food production and shelter, remains unexamined. I want to be precise about the scale of what this means. The IMF's 2023 Article 4 consultation for Nigeria, published in June 2024, identified land tenure insecurity and low agricultural productivity as structurally connected. The consultation documented that Nigeria's food import bill, which puts direct pressure on the exchange rate, which raises the cost of everything priced in dollars, is partly a function of domestic agricultural underperformance, and domestic agricultural underperformance is partly the land tenure system that 36 state governors administer.
This is not a defense of Tinubu's economic management. The petrol subsidy removal was implemented without a documented palliative delivery mechanism that worked at scale. The Naira redesign policy, which preceded the protests and devastated the informal sector, was a CBN decision made under federal authority. These are genuine federal failures with documented human costs. But the 380 billion naira I placed in front of you at the opening of this analysis, the state's share of FAAC in a single month, is sitting in 36 government coffers, administered by 36 governors who have not been asked in any structured public forum I have found to account for what they have done with it. I want to ask you something directly, not as a call to react, but as a genuine question I am sitting with myself. Given what the Land Use Act does to food prices and shelter costs, and given that its administration is entirely in the hands of state governors, does that change how you understood the question I opened with about why the demand to go is addressed to one man and not to 36? Tell me in the comments. I read them, and what you tell me shapes what I analyze next. Here is what I believe the evidence establishes, and I'm going to be precise about what I can prove and what I am inferring. What I can prove from the documents and figures I have walked you through. 1. The constitutional distribution of authority over the primary drivers of cost of living in Nigeria, food, shelter, healthcare, primary and secondary education, places that authority predominantly at the state level. This is in the text of the 1999 Constitution and in the documented administrative practice of every tier of government since 1999. 2. FAAC distributions to the 36 states increased materially after the May 2023 fuel subsidy removal, with states collectively receiving figures in excess of 380 billion naira in the first month after removal and increasing thereafter. This is in the published FAAC communiques. 3. The Land Use Act of 1978, administered by state governors, structurally constrains agricultural output and urban land supply in ways that contribute independently to food prices and shelter costs. This is in the World Bank, IMF, and NIESV documentation I have cited. 4. The accountability infrastructure of the August 2024 protests, the organizing networks, the demands, and the media framing was directed exclusively to the federal executive without documented accountability demands on state governors for their administration of the functions and revenues within their constitutional jurisdiction. What I am inferring, not proving. I believe the consistent direction of Nigerian political anger towards the federal center is not purely spontaneous. It is in part a product of a revenue architecture that was deliberately designed by military governments to concentrate political power and political accountability at the center, and it has outlasted every attempt at democratic reform because the beneficiaries of that architecture, including state governors who receive transfers without being held accountable for them, have no incentive to change it. I opened this video with a specific question. I'm going to answer it now, with everything I have built towards that answer. The question was, if states receive more from FAAC than the federal government itself, why is the demand to go addressed exclusively to one man? The answer has 3 parts. First, the constitutional architecture of revenue centralization has, over 50 years, trained Nigerian citizens to locate economic sovereignty at the federal center, because that is where the money visibly originates, even when it is administered downstream by other actors. Second, the protest political infrastructure that exists in Nigeria, the Labour Congress, the civil society networks, the opposition party alignments, has its institutional memory, its media relationships, and its organizing models built around federal accountability demands. It is not that Nigerians don't know governors exist. It is that the infrastructure for holding governors accountable through mass political pressure has not been built with the same depth. Third,
And this is the part I find most analytically significant. Targeting the federal executive is politically legible in a way that targeting 36 governors simultaneously is not legible within the grammar of protest politics as it has developed in Nigeria. If this pattern continues unchanged, here is what I believe changes in the Nigerian institutional landscape in the next 5 to 10 years. The federal government will continue to absorb accountability demands that belong structurally at the state level. State governments will continue to receive federation transfers with minimal public accountability for their application. The Land Use Act will remain unreformed because the state governors who would need to support its amendment benefit from the discretionary power it gives them over land allocation. Food prices will remain structurally elevated above what oil price and exchange rate movements alone would produce, because the agricultural productivity constraint rooted in land tenure insecurity will remain unresolved. And the protest cycle, Occupy Nigeria 2012, #EndSARS 2020, #EndBadGovernance 2024, will continue, addressed to whoever is in Asoro Rock, without resolving the structural conditions that produce the grievances. The one thing I cannot yet answer, and I think you should be asking too, is this. Is there a version of Nigerian protest politics that can simultaneously hold the federal executive accountable for what it controls and hold 36 state governors accountable for what they control? And if that version exists, what would its organizing infrastructure need to look like? I don't have a documented answer, but I think it's the most important political design question in Nigeria right now. If anything I have told you contradicts what you have read or heard elsewhere, go verify it. That is not a disclaimer. That is the standard I hold this channel to. If you find an error, tell me in the comments. That is how I get better. If this analysis gave you something you didn't have before, share it with one person who is working with incomplete information on this subject, not for the views, because accurate information is genuinely scarce in this environment, and the people who have it have a responsibility to move it. Subscribe if you want the next analysis. I will be here.